Michael Dillabo. How do you pronounce it? It's 1,000 Pine Points to you for being here first. Thank you so much for hearing my call. That inner voice of PineCreek within you. Jay Ritchie, I got a question for you. Can you be divine and not God? The truest question for you. Can you be the Messiah and not divine? That's your question. Let's see, who else am I going to pick on here? Just random. Wayne Mills. Can you be the Messiah and not the Son of Man who will conquer the world? Let's see. Alexandra Hanaz. Here's your question. Can you be both the Messiah and the Son of Man and divine and yet not God? Who should I ask this last question to? Azoro Dube. Here's your question. If Jesus isn't God and you worship Jesus as God, are you guilty of idolatry? Here's your questions. So you can answer in the chat. Some of these questions are hard. And I don't think there's a consensus amongst Christians or Jews or even Muslims. The answer says, speaking of Muslims, there's a channel that's been using a lot of my videos because I'm kind of, beaten up on David Wood, and they like that, and so they use my videos to get views and so forth. I don't mind that, but as long as, please, let your viewers know, hey, this guy is PineCreek, and here's a link to the whole video if they want to watch it, which I've noticed that this channel is not doing. What's the name of that channel? Muslims by Choice. I think that's the name of the channel. If you look on that channel, I think they've used 5 of my videos. But I'm going to use David Wood again because he's just so juicy. That's Camille. I use the word juicy because of it. I see you in the live stream chat because of how you identified the historicists that you work with or talk with, and I'm going to admit that he is talking to a Muslim or critiquing a Muslim apologist, and I agree that the Muslim apologist took things out of context, and I agree that the Gospel of John probably is saying, hey, Jesus is pretty close to God, if not God. But we'll talk about that as we go. So let's get started.
Here, when Zakir Naik quotes the book of John, chapter 5, verse 30.
That's his name, Zakir Naik.
Gospel of John, chapter number 5, verse number 30. I can of my own self do nothing.
So Jesus says, on my own I can do nothing. Muslim apologists use that to say, see, he's not God. If he was God, he could do everything. Well, without contradicting his nature, of course.
Naik doesn't bother to give the context of the verse, but he offers it as a proof text against the deity of Christ and the doctrine of the Trinity. Obviously, if you're reading the verse as Zakir Naik reads it, Jesus sounds like he's saying that he doesn't have the power to do anything.
I can of my own self do nothing.
So, according to Zakir Naik, Jesus' words in the book of John, chapter 5, verse 30, prove that he's just a man, a helpless human being, certainly not God. You can learn a lot about a man by considering how he reads the Bible.
I love that sentence that David Wood said. Let me quote him here. You can learn a lot about a man by considering how he reads the Bible. I wonder how David Wood reads the Bible, because I would like to learn a lot about David Wood. David, when you read the Bible, do you accept every claim as historical? Do you say it's inerrant, that whatever it claims to be true is true? Do you view every part of the Bible as the inspired Word of God? Are there probably some things, do you look at the Gospel of John? Do you read the Gospel of John and say to yourself, oh yeah, everything that it says Jesus said happened in history? We could have taken a video recorder and taped Jesus saying these exact words. Do you believe that, David Wood? You can learn a lot about a man by considering how he reads the Bible, right? Are there things that Jesus is reported to have said in the Gospel of John that you think that Jesus probably didn't say? Or do you just accept all of it? You can learn a lot about a man by considering how he reads the Bible. I'm going to, Christians do not, in general, in my opinion, listen to anything atheists have to say when it comes to the Bible because they believe that the spirit of Satan, no, that's wrong, that we're under the power and the dominion of the evil one. We walk in darkness. We do not have the Holy Spirit to lead us in all truth. That's in the Bible. That's scriptural. And so therefore, when it comes to interpreting the scriptures, we're at a huge disadvantage. So I would like to show you what Christians have to say about the Gospel of John. And maybe, just maybe, you'll listen to them. And so let me bring that up here. And I think these are Christians that most evangelical apologists have heard of. So let's start with Michael Licona, shall we? And credit to Camille Greger. He summarized a lot of this in a document that we share, and then I put it in PowerPoint. And if you want the sources for all this, I can provide them through Camille's document. But Michael Licona, on the Gospel of John, he says that the author of the Gospel of John uses narrative elasticity, stretching the truth, maybe. Michael Licona says that the author may have invented the doubting Thomas story. Licona says that the author of Gospel of John altered the day of the crucifixion, and that he may have invented the breathing on the disciples to receive the Holy Spirit, and then they received the Holy Spirit. But if you don't believe that Michael Licona said these things, just ask Lydia McGrew. She'll tell you. Here's Craig Keener. Remember, he's the guy who wrote the book on miracles and so forth. He's a real historian, apparently. This was his views on the Gospel of John, that John takes significant liberties with the way he reports events, that he rearranged many details in the service of his symbolic message. He moved the cleansing of the temple to the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Licona didn't say that, but Keener did. He altered the day of the crucifixion. That's like Licona. And he may also have invented the breathing of the disciples to receive the Holy Spirit. By the way, so some Christians might be listening to say, well, hey, we got evangelical Christians who say these things, and yet, Doug, they're still Christians. I think Keener and Licona are still Christians because of spiritual type experiences. With Licona, it's like the hearing of the plates, garbage can lid flying, and he says he has his own personal experiences. I think when the real reason for your belief is these personal spiritual experiences, then you can be a historian and say stuff like this, and it doesn't shake your faith too much, because these are not the reasons why you believe. And Keener's definitely a miracle type guy. He's full in on that. Here's another quote about the Gospel of John. F.F. Bruce, who's now dead. The author of the Gospel of John did to the Jesus tradition what Shakespeare did to the histories of Plutarch. Now, what is he saying here? He's saying that, you can record a lot of accurate events, but take a ton of artistic liberties. And I think that's what he's saying about what the Gospel of John is doing. Finally, Craig Evans on the Gospel of John. I would be very surprised if we caught Jesus uttering, I am this, and I am that, in one of these big, long speeches that we find in John. This aspect of the Gospel of John I would not put in the category of historical. It's a genre question. So I don't know what a lot of Christians do with this when they hear stuff like this. Do they dismiss these historians who I think say other things that they value deeply? But here's here is Craig Evans talking to Bart Ehrman. I'm just going to play maybe a minute of this, and so you can hear for himself what he thinks.
In the Gospel of John, Jesus says a lot of I am sayings, very famous sayings. Before Abraham was, I am. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world, etc. These I am sayings. And at one point, of course, he says, the Father and I are one. So my question to you is, do you think the historical Jesus really said these things?
I think most of these things were not uttered as we find them by the historical Jesus.
Now, he goes on to say that a lot of the things maybe were said by the historical Jesus, and that we can get, sort of similar to Licona, that we can get the gist of things. But he's basically saying, yeah, unlike David Wood, I think, we just can't say that everything that we read in the Gospel of John that claims Jesus said this, no, we can't assume that's true. And yet, I think guys like David Wood will just gobble it up and say, this is the Word of God. If it says Jesus said this, then Jesus said this. You can learn a lot about a man by considering how he reads the Bible.
What can we learn about world-famous Muslim apologist Zakir Naik from his treatment of John 5:30? Let's find out by doing something that people like Zakir Naik don't want their listeners to do ever. We're going to read the passage.
We're going to read the passage, he says, okay?
I'll just summarize the first 15 verses of the chapter.
We're going to read the passage, but not read the first 15 verses. So I'm going to actually read the first 15 verses and do something that apologist David Wood did not do. And there's some interesting things in the first 15 verses, and I'm not sure why, well, maybe there's a reason why David Wood didn't want to read it. So John chapter 5, Jesus heals on the Sabbath. After there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now they're in Jerusalem. Is this the version that he likes? No, I got to use the version he likes. Easy. No, it's not the easy read version. It's the EVS. Here we go. I think this is his favorite version. English Standard Version. That's the one he has on the screen. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roof colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids. Yeah, what does invalids mean? Blind, lame, paralyzed. One man was there who had been invalid for 38 years. Okay, when I first read this, I'm thinking, okay, whenever you see numbers in the New Testament, it usually has a meaning. And so I started doing Google searches on 38 years in the Bible. And I stumbled upon, wouldn't you know it, and then I read a commentary on it that said that the 38 years could represent the amount of time that the Israelites were in the land called Kadesh, which is just outside the Promised Land. You got the Promised Land, and they're just outside it. So when the Israelites went from Egypt on their way to the Promised Land, most people said, well, they were in the wilderness for 40 years. That's actually not true. It took them only about 2 years or so to get there. And then in the 3rd year, they were at this land called Kadesh for 38 years. And they were stuck there for many reasons. Disobedience, and they got the Canaanites that they had to kill and all these things. But they were stuck there, just so close to the life-saving Promised Land, but they were immobile. And I'm thinking, wow, this is pretty cool. Now, maybe I'm just suffering from parallelmania here. But, if you agree that there's numbers have significance in the New Testament, maybe there's something to this. So here we have a man who cannot walk, as we'll read later, for 38 years, and he's by the pool that gives him comfort and soothes him and helps him to It's like the pool is his promised land. So one man was there who had been invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" Now that's a pretty silly question, right? If you got a man who's paralyzed or cannot walk or something's wrong with him, and here you got Jesus saying, "Do you want to be healed?" Now maybe there's an assumption there that some people don't want to be healed. That could be true. Or maybe this guy has been, Jesus talked to him earlier and kind of already knew where he was coming from and just viewed him as a whiner and a complainer. By the way, the Israelites were whining and complaining to Moses and Aaron a lot, right? The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool. And when the water is stirred up and while I'm going, another steps down before me." So it kind of sounds like this guy can't walk. And he says, like, I want to go in the pool, but then someone butts in front of me and I can't get in. It's too crowded, I guess. Jesus said to him, "Get up, take your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, took up his bed, and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath, so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to take up your bed." Isn't it interesting that you can't take up your bed on the Sabbath? Does that really work? But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is this, the man who said this to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" And now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, and there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more." This is interesting. "Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." Now, what does that mean? I actually think a lot of Christians read verses like this and are very superstitious, that if they sin against God, that God will smite them with some disease. Trust me, I've been raised around people who think this way. My dad thinks this way a little bit, especially with things like tithing. My dad drilled into me at a young age that if you don't tithe, something's bad's going to happen to you. He's either going to take away your job, your money, or something like that. And, my dad's kind of justified in this. He says, like, sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. God might hurt you if you sin. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who healed him. And this is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." So unlike David Wood, I did read the first 15 verses. He just summarized it. And let's continue.
Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath, and this upsets the Jewish leaders. They regard miraculously healing someone as work, and you're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. We'll pick up the story in verse 16 of the chapter Zakir Naik quotes to show that Jesus is just a helpless human being. "And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, 'My Father is working until now, and I am working.'" Uh-oh. You see, Jews weren't allowed to work on the Sabbath. But there was a discussion among the Jewish rabbis. They reasoned that since God sustains the universe even on the Sabbath, God works on the Sabbath. Jews don't get to work on the Sabbath, but God works on the Sabbath. How does Jesus answer the Jewish leaders when they complain that he's working on the Sabbath? He says, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." Like Father, like Son.
Like Father, like Son. Now, if you're a Christian and you believe that Jesus is God, I have a question for you. If David Wood just said, like Father, like Son, would it be wrong of me to say, like Son, like Father? If they're one, like Son, like Father. But then we have a problem, don't we, if we say like Son, like Father, just like we say like Father, like Son. And that is, what did Jesus do? He lowered himself. He became a servant. Some would say he became a slave to humanity by willingly becoming a human and dying. Like son, like father, can God lower himself, become a servant, and die?
Now, what does he sound like he's saying here? If Jesus says, yeah, I know human beings aren't supposed to work on the Sabbath, but God the Father is working on the Sabbath, so I'm working on the Sabbath too, because I'm the Son, what does he sound like he's claiming?
It sounds like he's claiming that, hey, God can do good things. God does good things. He is good. And so I can do good things. So if God is love, I can love. If God is merciful, I can be merciful. It might be just as simple as that.
He sounds like he's claiming to be in the same category with God. And as the next verse shows, that's exactly what the Jewish leaders thought he was saying. Look at the heading, by the way. Verse 18.
Yeah. Look at the heading, by the way. That heading was probably written by a Christian.
This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God.
Yeah, maybe these Jews who were saying this are just flat out wrong, because calling God your Father, does that make someone equal to God in itself? Let's go to, shall we open Bibles up? Turn your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 6. And I'll show you an example of Moses calling Yahweh his Father. Do you thus repay the Lord, you foolish and senseless people? Is not he your Father who created you and made you and established you? Is Moses claiming here to be in the same category as God? I don't think so. Let's go to, this is a good one. John chapter 20, verse 17. Let me make this bigger. This is Jesus talking to Mary Magdalene, saying, Jesus said to her, do not cling to me. Yeah, I actually share that with Jesus. I don't like people who are clingy. Do you? So me and Jesus are alike in that way. Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father. Jesus is saying God's his Father, and David Wood's saying, well, that's putting him in the same category as God. But he's saying that about Mary. He's like side by side, my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. Jesus is saying, I'm going to ascend to my God and your God. I remember reading this when I was a Christian, thinking, this does not sit right with me. And I don't think this verse sits right with a lot of Christians. So I don't think Mary is in the same category of God. Is she, David Wood?
In the Bible, people or groups of people can be children of God in various ways. We're all children of God in the sense that God created all of us. This is the basis for Ahmed Deedat's sons by the tons response. Oh, you claim that Jesus is the Son of God, but God has lots of sons in the Bible. Yeah, there are lots of sons of God in the Bible, but the phrase Son of God is used in different ways.
Yes, and that's why the Son of God is used in different ways, and that's why I asked the person in the live stream chat, can someone be the Messiah and not the Son of God as defined as a conqueror of the last kingdom as in Daniel 7? But we'll get to that.
The question is, what does the phrase Son of God mean when it's applied to Jesus? Does it mean something more than when it's applied to me? In this passage, Jesus is claiming to be the Son of God in a unique way. When he says that the Father is working on the Sabbath, so he's working on the Sabbath, the complaint is that he's calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Notice, the Jews thought that Jesus was claiming to be a separate God, a separate deity. He's the Son who's equal with God, but who can act on his own, separate from the Father.
Which tells you that the belief back then, and even guys like Dr. Heiser will agree with this, that you can be divine and not God.
But Christianity doesn't teach that Jesus is a separate God, so someone is misunderstanding something here.
Christianity does not teach that Jesus is a separate God, he said. Have you not heard of Unitarian Christians? I guess David Wood would say Unitarians are not true Christians. Basically, any form of Christianity that's non-Trinitarian, I think David Wood would say is heretical. But I want to bring up Philippians 6. Let's see. How do you spell Philippians? There we go. Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 to 11. And this is just showing that you can have a divine being that's kind of sort of like God, but not God. Who, though he was in the form of God, talking about Jesus. Now, what does that mean? In the form of God. Did not count equality with God as a thing to be grasped. What exactly does that mean? But emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. This is why I brought up, when David Wood said like father, like son, can you say like son, like father? Is that something Yahweh, God the Father, would do? Take the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men? Probably not. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him. Now, if Jesus is God, is he exalting himself? Or are we just thinking that even if he was in a God mode, a human mode, an incarnated mode, how can he still exalt himself? Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee shall bow in heaven and on earth and under earth, and every tongue confesses that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. So basically we have this idea that two divine beings, and one divine being goes down to earth and is willing to die, and because of that, God, the CEO, I guess, is kind of like saying, hey, you the man, come sit next to me on my right. Now, if Jesus was God, is God, he would sit on the throne in the middle, not on the right. But anyhow, so that, and remember, this is Paul, which predates the Gospel of John by, according to consensus or majority of scholars, 40 years?
Now, if Muslims are right, and Jesus is a mere human being and a Muslim prophet, he's going to correct their misunderstanding by saying, wait, you think I'm claiming to be equal with God? I'm not claiming to be equal with God. I'm only human, just like the rest of you.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I read Philippians chapter 2, because he's not equal to God. He lowered himself to become a servant.
But if Christians are right, and Jesus is the divine Son who has the nature and attributes of God and who is one with the Father, he's going to correct their misunderstanding by saying, wait, you think I'm claiming to be a separate God? I'm not claiming to be a separate God. Yes, I'm God, but I don't act on my own. Everything I do comes from the Father because I'm one with the Father. Let's see what Jesus does. Verse 19. So Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord. Oh no, Christians. Jesus says that he can do nothing of his own accord. That sounds very similar to verse 30, where Jesus declares,
I can of my own self do nothing.
Yeah, and maybe what Jesus is saying there is the same what Christians would say. Christians, can you do anything on your own accord? Isn't it? Don't you believe that it is God the Father who created you, who sustains you, gives you breath of life, and without him you could do nothing on your own accord?
but wait a minute. When Jesus says that he can do nothing of his own accord, does he mean that he's a helpless human being? Or does he mean that he can't do anything separately from the Father because he's one with the Father? Let's at least read the entire verse before we decide. So Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing."
Is that important, this part right here? But only what he sees the Father doing. What if Jesus can't see everything that the Father's doing? Isn't it in the Gospel of Mark, or actually maybe all the synoptics, where Jesus says, "I don't know the hour, the time, the hour, the day of the return, of my return, or the Son of Man's return"? So Jesus definitely does not know things, or definitely does not know everything that the Father knows and sees. And so maybe Jesus is not in the same category as God, because he can only do what he sees the Father doing.
Whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise.
But only that which he sees the Father doing, right?
Jesus does whatever the Father does? What mere human being, what mere prophet would say, "Everything that God does, I do too"?
Doesn't, in the Gospel of Mark, doesn't Jesus refer to himself as a prophet? Someone can fact check me on that one.
So, when Jesus says the Son can do nothing of his own accord, is he claiming to be a mere human being, or is he claiming to be the divine Son who's one with the Father and therefore can't do anything separately from the Father?
But that can be said of any Christian, right? Can any Christian do something separate from the Father in the ultimate sense because he's created you and sustains you?
Let's keep reading. "For the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. And greater works than these will he show him, so that you may marvel. For as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will." If the Father raises the dead, so does the Son. Why? Because, as Jesus said, whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. Like Father, like Son.
Yeah, but is it like Son, like Father? In John 14:12, it says, very truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works that I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these. So if Jesus says that Christians can do greater works than Jesus, does that make them in the same category as God? Does that make them God? Or does that make them Jesus? I don't think so.
Let's continue. "For the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son." Red alert, theological red alert. Jesus says that the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son. But according to the Old Testament, God is the final judge.
Okay, now this is amazing to me, because David Wood here is admitting, now hear me out, Christians, I'm hearing David Wood admitting that the New Testament contradicts the Old Testament. But the way they get around that is say, "Oh, wait a minute, but Jesus is God, so then he's not contradicting." So listen to this.
It says that the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son. But according to the Old Testament, God is the final judge. In chapter 3 of the book of the prophet Joel, God declares that the nations will be gathered and that he will sit to judge all the surrounding nations.
Okay, so if David Wood, have you considered this idea? That the Old Testament says that God the Father will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Have you considered the plausibility, the possibility even, that the Gospel of John is wrong? That's just wrong. Maybe the Old Testament's right and the New Testament's wrong. That's very reasonable, isn't it? I don't think you can say it's reasonable as a Christian, because then I think you got to say, well, maybe it's wrong in other areas too.
The Quran also claims that God is the final judge. In Surah 22, verse 56, Allah declares, "The sovereignty on that day, the day of judgment, will be that of Allah, the one who has no partners. He will judge between them." Allah is the final judge according to Islam.
Okay, so which is more consistent with the Old Testament, the Quran or the Gospel of John?
But Jesus says that the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son. There are two possibilities here.
There are two possibilities. Whenever you hear someone say there's two possibilities, there's probably more possibilities, but let's listen.
Either the Bible and the Quran are wrong and God isn't the final judge because he's handed all judgment over to a helpless human being, or God is indeed the final judge because Jesus is God, and within the nature of the one God, the Father has given all judgment to the Son.
Or, he said two options. Well, here's the third option. The third option is the Quran is right in this aspect, the Old Testament's right in this aspect, and the Gospel of John is wrong. Isn't that an option? Or is that an option that you don't want to consider?
But why would the Father give all judgment to the Son? Jesus tells us, "For the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father." Father and Son are one, but the Father hands all judgment over to the Son so that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Tell me,
Just as they honor the Father. Does that mean the exact same way?
do we honor mere human beings the same way we honor the Father? Of course we don't.
But does the text actually say in the exact same way one should honor the Son as they honor the Father? And let me bring up, I'll just read it. Romans 13, 1-2. It says that that Christians should respect and adhere the authorities instituted by God. And whoever resists the authorities instituted by God, he resists God, because God instituted those authorities. So by dishonoring the government authorities that God has put there, you dishonor God.
Do we honor human prophets the same way we honor the Father? Absolutely not. What is the only possible basis for honoring the
Whenever you hear someone say the only possible, your BS detector should go up.
Son just as we honor the Father? The only way we would honor the Son just as we honor the Father is if the Son has the same nature and attributes as the Father.
If the Son has the same nature and attributes as the Father, does that mean the Father has the same nature and attributes as the Son? And remember, the Son, one of the attributes of the Son was humbling himself, becoming a slave, a servant to humanity, and dying on the cross. If they're one, then, and they have the same attributes in nature, then it should go both ways. Or is it just unidirectional?
Side note, where did Jesus say, "I am God, worship me"? Common question from Muslims. But notice, Jesus says that all human beings must honor the Son just as we honor the Father. One of the ways
Just as we honor the Father, not the exact same way. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. Honor your mother and father. And when you honor your mother and father, you're honoring God at the same time because you're obeying him. But you're not honoring your mother and father in the exact same way as you're honoring God, because you shouldn't worship your mother and father.
we honor the Father is through worship. Jesus says that we have to honor the Son in the same way.
No, it says just as. There's actually, I brought up a few versions of that. The RSV, King James Version, the NASB, they all say something like, that all may honor the Son even as they honor the Father. Now, some Christians might say, well, that's the same thing. To say honor the Son even as you honor the Father is the same thing saying that you may honor the Son in the exact same way as you honor the Father. But I don't think you can go there. I don't think that's reasonable. But
what happens if we don't? The verse continues. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Do Muslims honor the Son? Does Zakir Naik honor the Son? According to Jesus, since they don't honor the Son, they dishonor the Father. And this is the chapter that Muslims go to in order to prove that Jesus was just a human prophet of Islam?
I'm not sure. That's a good question David asked. Do Muslims honor the Son? Talking about Jesus. They might. In the same way as they honor Moses. In the same way they honor Elijah. I think Jews honor the prophets of God. Now, I grant that it's not the exact same way as honoring, but I don't think this verse is saying it, that you should honor Jesus the exact same way as you honor God.
This chapter condemns them. But there's more, Jesus declares. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Wait a minute. Jesus is the one who raises the dead? I wonder if he simply means that he raises particular people when he performs miracles. Because if he means that he raises the dead at the resurrection, we're going to have another theological red alert. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. Ha! You see there, David, Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. This means he's claiming that he's a mere human being. So let's ignore everything else he says and go with that.
And as David Wood rightly pointed out earlier, that Son of Man means many things in the Bible, and we're going to get to that.
Yeah, that works as long as you completely ignore the fact that the title Son of Man, as Jesus uses it, is a divine title for a particular Son of Man that the prophet Daniel sees in a vision. Do yourself a favor, Muslims, and read Daniel chapter 7, where the entire world serves the Son of Man who comes on the clouds of heaven.
Okay, so he says, do yourself a favor, Muslims, and read Daniel 7. So I'm going to read a little bit and do myself a favor. And this is why I asked the question at the very beginning of the live stream, is the Messiah the same as the Son of Man? Daniel 7, I don't think that's an easy question to answer. A lot of Christians might say, yeah, it is. It's obviously yes. Jesus was both the Messiah and the Son of Man, as talked about in Daniel chapter 7. I'll just read, 13 and 14 in the same version that David Wood likes. The Son of Man is given dominions, the title. This is in Daniel 7. It's a vision about the four kingdoms and all the kingdoms of Babylon and Persia and Greece and Rome, depending on if you're a Jew or secular or a Christian. Those kingdoms are compared to animals, like a lion, a winged lion, a leopard. What's the other one? And so, just like these kingdoms are like animals, scary animals. This is what Daniel sees later on in the vision. I saw in the night visions, and behold, the clouds of heaven. That's a sign of protection. There came one like a son of man. Oh, you guys can't see that. I saw in night visions, and behold, the clouds of heaven. There came one like the Son of Man. So remember, David Wood is saying that Jesus is the Son of Man as described in Daniel 7. Was Jesus a man, or was he like a son of man? He came to the Ancient of Days. Who's the Ancient of Days? That's probably Yahweh. And was presented before him. So if Jesus is presented before Yahweh, and yet is Yahweh, and he's like a son of man, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So basically, this is like a divine being that's not a man, but like a man, who comes through the protection of God, Yahweh, through the clouds of heaven, who kicks butt at the end times, cleans out all these kingdoms, and starts a new kingdom that will last forever. And this is why I asked the question, is the Son of Man really the same thing as the Messiah? And can Jesus be the Son of Man if he's like a Son of Man? A lot of Christians, I think, say, no, Jesus is the Messiah and not the Son of Man. That's some angel-type guy-looking creature. Okay, let's go back to David Wood here.
At his Jewish trial, the Jewish leaders convicted Jesus of blasphemy for calling himself the Son of Man who comes with the clouds of heaven.
Okay, blasphemy. Before we get into the blasphemy part and why exactly Jesus was crucified, I want to play this. And Bart Ehrman's asked about what the Son of Man actually means, and he gets into it here. Let me make sure I got it to the right clip. Yeah.
To him.
Jesus also often uses the phrase "Son of Man," and in different verses of the Gospels, there seems to be different interpretations of what this means. It can be a bit confusing. In your book, you argue that the historical Jesus was actually talking about somebody else, even when there are some passages in the Gospels, in the New Testament canon, that appear that he was talking about himself. How do scholars kind of sift through these seemingly contradictory sayings of Jesus to find a historical core?
Well, it's really difficult, and there are very large books devoted to just this one question, large, complicated books. So it's a little hard to summarize it. But the way it works is Jesus uses the phrase Son of Man a lot, and he uses it often to refer to himself in the Gospels. And so he'll say something like, birds have nests and fox have lairs, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And so he's referring to himself as being an itinerant. Or he'll say, the Son of Man must go to Jerusalem and be rejected by the scribes and elders and be crucified, and on the third day be raised from the dead. So, clearly he's talking about himself.
Right.
So you get those kinds of sayings. You get another kind of saying in the Gospels where Jesus is not clearly identifying himself. For example, when he says in Mark 8:38, that whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of that one the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes on the clouds of heaven in the presence of the holy angels.
Okay, remember, David Wood is claiming that Jesus in the Gospel of John is the Son of Man, who is talked about in Daniel 7. And Bart Ehrman just mentioned Mark chapter 8. This is really interesting to me. Mark 8:38. Now, if Jesus is the Son of Man, as talked about in Daniel 7, how do you make sense of this? This is Jesus speaking in the Gospel of Mark. For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. It sounds like two different people here. This is what Bart Ehrman is saying. And I agree with Bart Ehrman. It sounds like two different people. Whoever's ashamed of me, Jesus, and my words, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed. Now, if David Wood is right, and that the Son of Man talked about in Daniel 7 is the Son of Man talked about in John chapter 5, how can Jesus be the Son of Man when we got two people being ashamed here? And add to that the Son of Man is like a man, not actually a man. It's okay to doubt. Actually, let's get back to, I want to hear the ending of this.
Now, unless you already thought that Jesus was the Son of Man, there's nothing in that saying that would make you think so.
Right,
In fact, it looks like he's talking about someone else. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's the situation we have with the Son of Man saying. Some of them he's clearly talking about.
Troy in the live stream chat says, Doug, this is easy. The writer of Mark didn't see Jesus as the Son of Man, but a different guy decades later conflated the two. That sounds like a reasonable hypothesis, Troy.
Himself, and in others, it's not so clear. In fact, there's nothing to make you think he is talking about himself. So scholars have long known that some of these sayings of the Son of Man are not sayings that Jesus actually said. And so which ones did he say and which ones did he not say?
Right.
So my view of this is that Christians who did understand that Jesus was the Son of Man had him talk in ways in which he identified himself as the Son of Man. But Christians would never make up a saying in which Jesus appeared to be talking about someone else, because the Christians thought he was talking about himself. And so if there are sayings in which Jesus appears to be talking about someone else, those are not sayings that the Christians would have made up about him, which means those must be the ones that Jesus really said.
Yeah, Bart Ehrman saying, hey, look, if he's... They would never, ever embarrass themselves. Jesus wouldn't embarrass himself by saying that he isn't the Son of Man. If these authors believe that Jesus was the Son of Man, they would never write that. So the true historical claims, sayings of Jesus are the ones where Jesus views the Son of Man as someone else. This is what Bart Ehrman's saying. I don't know if I agree with Bart Ehrman here. I would just say that the authors of the New Testament knew the Old Testament well. They read Daniel chapter 7, and they penned in this whole narrative of the Son of Man. But as Troy said in the live stream chat, the Gospel of Mark viewed the Son of Man as someone different than Jesus, and the Gospel of John viewed him as the same person.
And so, if you follow that criterion, then when Jesus talks about the Son of Man, and he's talking about someone else, those are the ones that are authentic. And it's striking that those authentic sayings of the Son of Man are always about the Son of Man who's coming in judgment on the earth as a cosmic judge sent from heaven, in fulfillment of Daniel chapter 7, verses 13.
Right, Daniel 7, a cosmic figure, like a man, but not a man.
14. And so I think those are the sayings that probably Jesus really said, and he was predicting that God was soon going to send a Savior of the earth who was going to destroy all the forces of evil and bring in his kingdom.
Yeah, so then when...
Okay, let's see here. Do I want to go any further?
When he suddenly dies a humiliating death, presumably his disciples reinterpret this and think, oh, well, he must be the Son of Man that's returning to bring judgment. He must be the one, so they kind of attribute it to him talking about himself. Is that kind of the thought here?
Yeah, and so the deal is if the Son of Man is coming on the clouds of heaven in judgment on the earth, and the Christians come to think that Jesus is up in heaven now with God, they think, well, he's the Son of Man. And that's exactly right then. Then they start talking about him as the Son of Man, and they put Son of Man sayings on his lips.
Okay, so yeah, they put the Son of Man on his lips. I love that phrase. So the gospel writer of Mark basically viewed Jesus as the Messiah, but not the Son of Man, as prophesied in Daniel 7. But by the time you get to the Gospel of Mark, in the Gospel of Mark, the author believes that Jesus is both the Messiah and the Son of Man, even though in Daniel 7, the Son of Man is like a man, just like Greece is like, or just like Babylon is like a winged lion. Okay, let's get back to David Wood. I've been missing you, David.
They understood what that title meant. Muslims don't. But don't take my word for it. Read the book of Mark, chapter 14, verses 61 through 64. For once in your lives, my Muslim friends, try to understand what Jesus is actually saying instead of forcing the views of an illiterate 7th century caravan robber onto him.
So this is David Wood saying, hey, look, Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, and he was crucified for blasphemy. And that's what it says in Mark 14, 61 to 64, which he alluded to. Now, but the question is, what's another hypothesis? Why would Pilate have Jesus crucified if it wasn't blasphemy? Anyone? Maybe because he just claimed to be the king of the Jews. And Pilate said, hey, look, Rome is the king, is the rulers of the Jews, not you. So maybe he was crucified for that.
Even here in John 5, the chapter Zakir Naik quotes to prove that Islam is true, the Son of Man is the final judge. And the Quran claims that God is the final judge. You can get this. Almost done. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice. Whose voice? The voice of Jesus, who is, according to this passage, the Son of God and the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment.
I thought that Christianity was about grace, that you're saved. Salvation is achieved through grace by faith, through faith. Not through works, lest any man should boast. But in John chapter 5, verse 29, do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. The author of John sounds like a Muslim. The author of John sounds like a Jew. That resurrection's based on works, doing good or doing evil. Too much?
Red alert, red alert.
Yeah, red alert.
Theological red alert. Jesus just claimed that he's the one who raises the dead, all the dead, at the resurrection. According to the Old Testament, who raises the dead at the resurrection? 1 Samuel 2:6. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. According to the Quran, who raises the dead at the resurrection? Surah 22, verse 7. And surely the hour is coming, there is no doubt about it, and certainly Allah will resurrect those who are in the graves. And yet Jesus claims that he's the one who will raise everyone from the dead.
Well, to be more precise, the author of the Gospel of John claims that Jesus said this.
Are these the teachings of a man who thinks he's a mere human being, just a prophet of God?
You can learn a lot about a man by how he reads the Bible. This is David Wood's own words earlier in this live stream. David Wood, talk to Michael Licona, talk to Craig Keener, talk to Craig Evans, and ask them, do they believe Jesus said all the things that the author of John claims Jesus said?
And now for the very next verse. The verse Zakir Naik, he's a medical doctor, quotes to Muslims to show Muslims that even the Bible agrees with Islam. John chapter 5, verse 30. Jesus says, I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Now that we've read the passage, let's go ahead and have a pop quiz.
I love pop quizzes.
When Jesus says, I can do nothing on my own, I seek not my own will, is he saying, A, I'm a helpless human being, a simple prophet of Allah, or B, When I claimed to be the divine Son of God, you Jewish leaders thought I was claiming to be a separate God who acts on his own. But I'm here to correct you. Even though I have the same nature and attributes that the Father has, and even though I'm the final judge of all people and the one who raises the dead, I do not act on my own. I cannot act on my own. I can do nothing on my own because I'm not a separate God. I'm one with the Father.
Okay, so it's a good thing that David Wood is not a teacher at a school, because this is a horrible multiple choice. A is, I'm a helpless human being, a simple prophet of Allah. Prophets were really revered in amongst Jews, so I wouldn't use simple or helpless. They got God on their side, prophets, right? They can do. Didn't Moses part the Red Sea? Didn't Elijah even raise the dead? At least one person. So I thought I would help David Wood here and add to the multiple choice. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. I couldn't match the shade. But here's two more options. C, Jesus did say these things, is divine, does raise the dead, does judge, yet is not equal to the Father. Isn't that a possibility? I think it was for many, many years, even in the first and second centuries in that area. Or D, Jesus didn't mean anything because he probably didn't say these things. The author of John puts these words on the lips of Jesus for theological reasons. And if you came late to this live stream, I have guys like Licona and Craig Keener and Craig Evans admitting that this is probably the case. Maybe not for this specific verse, but in general, the author of the Gospel of John takes many theological liberties.
Not a separate God, I'm one with the Father. Which one is Jesus saying? And yet Zakir Naik rips Jesus' words completely out of context, twists their meaning beyond recognition, and convinces his gullible listeners that Jesus in John chapter 5 agrees with Muslims. And the Muslims who are being deceived by Zakir Naik cheer for him.
I'm just hearing the irony is so thick.
As he lies to them.
Gospel of John, chapter number 5, verse number 30. I can of my own self do nothing.
Why do Islam's most popular speakers and apologists constantly lie about Jesus in order to deceive their listeners? That's the spirit of Islam, my friends.
I'm going to use David Wood's own words right back at him. Yes, why do Christians' most popular speakers and apologists constantly leave out important facts about the New Testament in order to deceive their listeners? That's the spirit of Christianity, my friends.
And if you don't believe me that the spirit of Islam is the spirit of deception, sit down with your Muslim friends and show them this video.
And if you don't believe me, sit down with your Christian friends and show them this video of how even Christians don't trust the historicity of the Gospel of John.
Show them that Jesus is clearly claiming to be the divine Son of God throughout the passage, and that Zakir Naik completely, utterly, totally distorts the meaning of the passage when he rips verse 30 out of context. 99 times out of 100, your Muslim friends won't care.
99 times out of 100, your Christian friends won't care. They won't care that apologists often ignore New Testament textual criticism.
They won't care that Zakir Naik is lying about Jesus, as long as Zakir Naik continues doing something far more important, convincing Muslims not to question Islam.
Christians won't care as long as apologists do something far more important, convincing Christians not to question the historicity of the Gospel of John.
Hopefully, you'll sit down with the 1 out of 100 who does care, the one who's better than his religion calls him to be, the one who hates deception.
Hopefully you sit down with the 1 out of 100 Christian who does care, the one who is better than his religion calls him to be, the one who hates deception.
If you sit down with him and show him how Muslim apologists constantly, endlessly lie about Jesus, he will soon be on his way out of Islam.
And show him how some Christian apologists constantly, endlessly leave out information about the historicity of Jesus found in the New Testament. Christians will soon be on their way out of Christianity. David, you got to practice. You got to learn to start using the same phrases you use against Muslims, against yourself, against Christians, because we can do it. We can flip this right back on you. I think you're the type of man who does not for 1 second agree with, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think you agree with guys like Michael Licona and guys like Craig Keener when they say things like this. Do you think your listeners would have a different slant on what you're saying here in John chapter 5 if they knew that other Christians, historians, don't put too much stock in the historicity of it, that when the author of John says Jesus said such and such, that doesn't mean he actually said such and such? This aspect of the Gospel of John I would not put in the category of historical. We have Craig Evans saying this is a genre question. We're not reading history when we're reading John. I would say that when you read any of the Gospels, my rough guess would be you may be reading 10% history. I don't know. What do you guys say? Some people say 0. You can't say 0 because they mention like real places, real people, and so forth. And I did a video on what I think is history and what I think is not, and color coded and all. Do a search on historicity of Mark or something like that. Let's see if there's any pithy comments here. Brett Lasky says, if the Gospel of John was never written or survived, would the Trinity hypothesis exist? Great question. I say no. I think the Gospel of John is the Gospel where it's the most, you could get it from the other Gospels, but it's the most direct. But it's also the latest. Written in the 90s AD, probably. Some say later. Camille just called me a boomer. Thank you so much for the donation, DB Cisco 666. Camille Gregor says, claiming to be the Messiah wasn't actually illegal in the Second Temple Judaism. Yeah, but blasphemy still was, though, right? So you can be the Messiah and still not blaspheme or claim to be the Messiah. And for those of you who came late, my questions at the beginning of the show was, can you be divine and not God? Of course you can. According to Dr. Heiser. Here Dr. Heiser has Yahweh, Godhead on top, sons of God on the bottom, which are divine beings, glorified divine angels, believers. And then you got angels on the bottom. So the Son of God described in Daniel 7, it's probably in the second box, which wouldn't make the Son of God, God. I'm going to go one more round here. I thought I saw some good comments. Nico asks, what do I think of Cam's new ascension argument? I don't know. Camille, is this... Oh, no, Cam posted it. Let me explain Camille's argument. I don't think it's public knowledge now. Christians, don't go away. You'll love this. Actually, let me get it right. I won't get it right no matter what I do. But let me bring it up here. The ascension argument basically says that, hey, if Jesus rose from the dead, and if he didn't ascend, he would be talked about months and years afterwards. So the ascension is very important. Very important. So just like there's minimal facts with the resurrection, shouldn't there be minimal facts for the ascension? Because the two are very tightly tied together. Because it can also be explained that if there's no talk about Jesus in the months or years after his supposed resurrection, that can also be explained that, well, he never rose from the dead. There we go. So let me ask this question to Christians. Let's assume Jesus hypothetically never ascended. What explains it better? What's more likely, that Jesus rose from the dead but never ascended, or that he didn't rise from the dead and never ascended? I think most Christians would admit that it's more likely that if Jesus never ascended, that he didn't rise from the dead. So those two are really tied together. I have to go one more round. Because if Jesus did rise from the dead but didn't ascend, we would expect record of Jesus interacting with people on earth in the years after his resurrection. So Cam's new thought experiment or new argument is basically showing, look, you need to come up with arguments to justify, to give historical gravitas to the ascension. And once you start looking into the ascension, you're going to be on shaky ground, in my opinion. Because there's apparently, Camille could probably list off the top of his head 2 or 3 ascension stories that predate Jesus, where figures go into the clouds. So what are the minimal facts for the ascension? Ben Roberts, Daniel 7 predicted a Jesus-shaped cloud. Camille must be right. Well, the cloud is basically that roof of protection over the Israelites. But I get the joke. Off the top of your head, you can do more than 3, Camille? Take the challenge. Go. Give me more than 3. Give me 3 figures in history that ascended into heaven. Quick, quick, quick. Wasn't did Tiberius ascend to heaven? No. Julius Caesar? Alexander the Great? Did I just do 3? Osiris? Poof. Hey, I got a great idea. I think my next video I'll talk about how to deal with street preachers, how to handle them, how to ask questions and so forth. Hey guys, thanks for hanging out with me. It was fun. Take care.